Hello world and welcome back to Money Makes Games. This is the 6th episode in our series on creating your very first game. And the game we're making is called Pongish, because it's like Pong. Now, let's get to it. My name is Moni and I make games. Firstly, let me say sorry for taking so long to get to all these videos. Life gets in the way and the YouTube stuff is a little lower down on my priority list. That being said, I'll try to get through this a little quicker in the coming weeks. Okay, where are we now? We can score, we can move our player, we have the ball goes, and it resets after each miss. So now we're kind of bored because we're playing against ourselves. So let's add a second player. We want to make this a local multiplayer game. And to do that, we're going to use something called the Player Input Manager, which is part of the Unity input system. Now, I'll link the documentation for you right there in the description. But basically what the Player Input Manager does for us is it monitors the controllers for which we've set up actions, and if a button is pressed on a controller, it joins a player to our game. So let's have a look and see how I set this up. Normally I would have gone live with this, but when practicing to get this ready, I had quite a few challenges and I threw away a few recordings. So in order to make this more clear for you and just a little quicker, I'll go over what I did. Now firstly, I've taken my player and renamed him Human Player because we want to do an AI player a little later on. Then I created a folder called prefabs and I dragged my player under there. Now this means that we now have a prefab. Okay, so after that we want to add a player input manager. So I created an empty game object, which you see I've disabled here, called player input manager, and I've also created two game objects which are basically just positions on the screen. There's one transform and there's the other transform. That's where our players will spawn. Now one of the problems that I ran into is something I'll demonstrate to you quickly. I have one human player on the screen and I press play. And now, when I press the button, a second player is supposed to pop up, but it didn't. This took me a little time to figure out, but the solution is actually quite simple. I delete the player and let the player input manager actually do its job. Now, what happens is if you already have an existing player on the screen that wasn't spawned by the player input manager, it just absolutely refuses to create a new player for you. Not sure why, also not sure what the reasoning behind it was, but that's what it does. So when you've set up your player prefab, you can drag it into this field called player prefab. On your player input manager component, you'll see an option to invoke Unity events or send messages when a new player joins. That's this notification behavior. Now under events, there's a player joined event and a player left event. We're not going to touch the player left event today, but the player joined is important to us because I've got a script for player joining. Now, if I didn't have this script, it would still join the extra player for me. Let's test that and I'll show you how it works. And this is literally how easy it's been to add a second local player. Now I've got that on my one controller, and there I've got a second player on my second controller. But notice that it does nothing else for me. I've got two players side by side, which is not going to make for a very fun game of Pong. So let's stop that. That's why I added this script. And let's look at the script first, and then we'll hook it up to the player input manager. Now my player join detector basically has an int for the number of players, so it keeps track of how many players have joined. Obviously, if we get the on player leave event, we'll decrement this when we get to that. And then we've got player start positions. That's an array of 2 positions. That's where our 2 players will spawn. And we've got our player input manager, which is a reference to the input manager set on this game object. As you can see here, there I did player input manager equals get component player input manager, which means that it looks for a player input manager on this game object, and if it finds it, it sets our player input manager. We're not doing anything in update right now. And then we have this function. I've declared here public void on player join. Now it has to be public because we need to access it from outside our script. On player joined, and it has one incoming parameter called player input. Oops. And Visual Studio wants to tell me all about it. So it's an object of type player input, or a script of type player input, and I've also called it player input in lowercase. Now, if you get a little red squiggly line here, that means it doesn't have a reference to this class. You need to add the using Unity Engine .input system reference to your script. You can also, if you want, type out player input like that. Let's delete this and I'll show you. See, the player input manager is also missing now because we took out that reference. And then if you right click on it, you can go quick actions and refactoring, and it says add that, and there you go. That solves that problem for you. Alright, in this script I've got a check to see if my number of players is the same or greater than the input manager. There's a problem there. Number of players is greater or equal to input manager max players. The way I had it set up, it would always just return because I would never get the chance to increment my players. So what happens is when we come in, initially we have 0 players, and then at the end of this function we're going to increment number of players, and the second time it's going to be 1, which actually means we have 2 players because we have player 0 and player 1. It's incrementing again now. The third time through we don't want an extra player because we've set our maximum players on the player input manager to 2. If you set it to 4, you would get 4 players. If not, if you set it to 1, only 1 player would spawn, and after that, every time it enters this function, it will return and do nothing else. Okay, for now, we're on 0 players. We come here and we say player input, which is a reference to the player input mono behavior that's attached to our player. If you were wondering, that is over here. And we say the transform of the game object attached to this player input is what we want, and we want to set its position. In other words, we want to move the player that was just spawned, which was passed to us by our player input manager. And we want that to be equal to player start positions and the index according to number of players, in this case 0, so the first one, dot position. And that's it. Basically, it's coming in, setting your new player's position, and you're good. Now, on our second player, we wanted to change the rotation of our player. Now, why do we want that? Well, because we want our player facing the opposite direction of our first player. You'll see a problem with this code. Basically, if I have more than 2 players, all the other players will be facing in the opposite direction. But that's okay for now. Since we are only going to stick to 2 players, that's fine. Depending on the type of game you want to write in future, maybe you want a 4-sided Pong game or something crazy, you can change this. Alright, so we take player input, again, reference to the newly spawned player, transform dot rotation. Now, rotations we can't set directly as a vector. We need to use a quaternion. So we go quaternion, and we use the Euler function on the quaternion, which basically lets us specify the rotation around 3 axes as a vector. So quaternion.Euler, new vector 3. We don't want to rotate around the x-axis, so that's 0. We don't want to rotate around the y, that's also 0. But the z-axis that basically runs straight into the screen, we want to rotate by 180 degrees so that our player faces opposite to what it was spawned as, or opposite to what the rotation of the other player is. And then finally, we just increment that number of players. Okay, that was a lot of explaining. Let's just see how it works. First, we go to our player input manager. We go to notification behaviors, and we want to go when a player has joined, please do this. What do we want to do? Well, on this player input manager, we want the player join detector, and we want the on player joined function to be called. Let's see if it works. Now, if you remember from our input setup or our actions, we set up the keyboard and one of the controllers. I press the button. Oh, and I have debugging going on. Let's just continue. I forgot that I said debug there. Okay, so my first one is spawned. Now if I press on my second controller, it will actually spawn a second player. Or, because I've got the keyboard set up as a control as well, I can press the keyboard and it does the same thing. But you might notice a small problem here. I have two players and they're both on the same side. So what's going on? Let's see if we can figure it out. Okay, player 1 start position is there. Player 2 start position is there. So that should solve that problem. What else is it? Player join detector is there. And on player joined is called. Let's do the debugging thing. Oh, come on. There we go. And let's run it and see what pops up. Joining the first player. Let's run through this and see. It has a reference to the player input. As you can see here, everything attached to it. We're not too worried about that right now. Let's go F10. Number of players is 0 and max player count is 2. So it's going to go straight past that. Oh. And it jumps straight to that line. Why is that happening? Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Let's see if we can join the second one. See, number of players is still 0 because I didn't increment there. And it keeps jumping over that line. That's pretty weird. Okay, let's stop this and have a look. I'm going to take out this little statement here. Go / star and / star / that way I can take out a whole block and just comment it out. And let's see if we play this. We'll leave out the debugging for now. And just see if it works out of the box. Okay, pressing the button on my controller 1, that works. Controller 2, and that works as well. So obviously our problem is here somewhere. Alright, let's have another look. Joining first, joining the second, and there we go. Now I can honestly tell you that I don't know why, but I have a suspicion that I never saved after changing the error I had up here, where it basically went through every time and just went return. But because it wasn't saved, it was still running the old version of the code, but showing us the new version on the screen. So always remember, after you've made the changes, Control S to save so you can run the correct code. Alright, let's do this. First controller, keyboard, and there we go. I can actually play against myself, except that the ball stays in the middle. Let's see if we can do something about that. As you can see, the angle that the ball came in is just, well, too close to 90 degrees, and it's not going anywhere. Now we could probably write some code to say randomize this and change it a little bit, but let's see if there's a better way. We've got our wall on top, and it has a box collider. Let's see what happens if we do this. There's a circle collider. And if we try to drag it out, okay, that's not gonna work. Circle collider won't do it for us. Let's see what other colliders we have. So we've got a capsule collider 2D. We have an edge collider, a sphere collider, which is 3D, so that's not going to work for us. Oh, we want a little bit of an edge on this, so just so we can change the angle slightly. We have several options here. First, we could basically put on a little edge collider like this. And we'll just, let's edit this a bit. So we could do something like that. Make it subtle. Or we could have actually taken the wall. Okay, let's stop editing the edge collider. We could have actually taken this wall and just tilted it a little bit. Make sure the ball gets out of that. We could have added a bunch of 2D circle colliders just to make little bumps. But for now, let's try that edge collider. Now it's going to bounce from here to there, to there, to there, which means we don't actually need to change both sides. But if we get a bounce straight down the middle here, we might still get stuck. So just to be safe, let's do the bottom wall as well. just go there and there, or make this one just go at a slight angle like that. Alright, that's not perfect, but it should solve that little problem for us. Okay, I've got 2 players going. I've got the ball going in that little pattern again. Still getting stuck. It's slowly moving, but because it's going this way from there and being moved back this way, I guess it's being a bit of a pain. Alright. Why does it get into that in the first place? I mean, bouncing off a player shouldn't be a problem. And it's right there. Alright. I'm going to pause the video here for a minute or two while I have a think about this, and then I'll get back to you. Okay, so after playing around a bit, I think for now our ideal shape would be something like this. So basically, if the ball comes in, it's either going to be shot away to this side or to this side. This isn't great, and I think it's something we should change in future. But for now, we'll leave it like this. And in the next video, we'll add an AI player so that if you cannot play with a friend right now, at least you have somebody to play against. Yeah, now is the time for you to sit, play around with us, change it, do something crazy, make a 4-player pongish game where you have players on the sides that have to catch the ball as well, or I don't know, make the ball randomly change direction. Do whatever you want, it's your game. Go out and find the fun in it. Until next time then, my name is Mani, and I make games.